Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of 10 Minutes to a Better Building. I'm your host, Tyler Kern. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the show. Today's episode is going to be focused on explaining some of the terms and concepts that are frequently used when we discuss sustainability. And so hopefully this can serve as a framework for helping you understand some of these concepts as we move forward. And joining me today is Julie Wolfington, joining me for her second appearance on the podcast. I think our first repeat podcast offender. So Julie, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thrilled to have you back on the podcast. So Julie, let's dive in. This is an important topic and a fun topic to get to discuss. Let's start off by discussing the term sustainability. I think on a basic level, we can all kind of define what that word means to a certain extent, but it's come to mean so much more in the context of climate change. So how would you define sustainability?
So I would define sustainability loosely or conceptually as the ability to exist constantly. It's a concept of taking resources from the earth at the same rate that they are restored. So in terms of sustainable development, it's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I stole that quote from a report called the Brundtland Report. But the bottom line is that in the past and currently, we're not restoring resources at the same rate that we are taking them. Therefore, the Earth's temperature is rising, hence global warming.
Very interesting. So we talk about sustainability a lot in terms of businesses, especially here on this podcast. So how do we know if a business is sustainable or a particular thing is sustainable?
Great question. So the concept of sustainability is very broad, and it actually refers to three main pillars. Some say more than that, but I'm going to say three main pillars. But it's environment, which is what most of us commonly think about when we think about sustainability, but it's also social and economic sustainability. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to stick with the environmental side of sustainability, but it's very important to understand that there are more aspects to true sustainability. So the most common way to measure the environmental sustainability of something is to measure the emissions associated with something. So, in terms of how sustainable is the business, we think of what are the emissions associated with that business? What are the emissions associated with a process or a particular thing? So let's take your car, for example, since we all have one of those. So you can see, now this is for a gas-powered car. If you have a Tesla, this example won't work. But so you can see the emissions coming out of your tailpipe when you're driving. So that's a visual thing that we can understand. Those are emissions. So a typical car emits about 4.6 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, CO2. In addition to carbon dioxide, which is most prevalent, cars also produce methane, nitrous oxide, as well as some other junk. So they produce all of that from the tailpipe, but they also produce hydrofluorocarbon emissions from leaking air conditioners and things like that. So the emissions of these other gases are small in comparison to CO2, carbon dioxide. However, the impact of them can be important because they have a higher GWP or global warming potential than CO2.
Interesting. So you've used a lot of terms there that I think might be helpful to go back and define. Specifically, as we talk about emissions and that sort of thing, we're talking about greenhouse gases, right? So talk us through greenhouse gases and some of the other terms that you were using there to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page about what each of these terms mean.
Sure. So greenhouse gases. So any reference to emissions is always a reference to greenhouse gases or GHGs. Greenhouse gases store heat. So I'm going to say that again because it's important to this. Greenhouse gases store heat. So they raise the temperature of the earth. So these gases include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, even water vapor. So they're not all bad. But they also include refrigerant gases, which we're very familiar with in our business. So as you can imagine, some of these gases are worse than others. So it's important to measure them. So greenhouse gases are measured by their capacity to store the sun's heat. So basically, how much can they store? How much do they store? So this is referred to as a particular greenhouse gases. It's their global warming potential. So that's their metric, their GWP. So since CO2, carbon dioxide, is the most prevalent greenhouse gas, And the reason it's the most prevalent greenhouse gas is because it results from burning fossil fuels. So it accounts for about 80% of all greenhouse gases. So that's a lot. So because it's so prevalent, scientists, I don't know who, some scientists, agreed to give it a GWP, or a global warming potential, of 1. So the GWP of CO2, sorry, that's a lot of acronyms, is 1. So all other greenhouse gases are then measured as a multiple of CO2. So this is referred to as the CO2 equivalent, or CO2e. That's a common term that I know a lot of you have heard. So it's helpful to understand where that comes from. So R134A, it's a very common refrigerant in our business, in the HVAC business. That has a GWP, or global warming potential, of 1,300 in comparison to CO2, which is 1.
Wow.
Yeah. So that means that one molecule of that refrigerant has the same heat storage capacity as 1,300 molecules of CO2. So saying that again, one molecule of that refrigerant, 134A, is 1,300 times as bad as one molecule of CO2. So that's why we have these ways to measure them, and that's why we have these equivalents.
That's a really interesting way to explain it, and I think that should definitely help people have a little bit better framework. But let's go back to our example now, talking about cars, right? So how good or bad are my vehicle's emissions for, sustainability and that sort of thing? How do we determine that? Because I do not have a Tesla, full disclosure. So yeah, so let's talk about that example again.
Okay, so what you're really asking, Tyler, great question. What is the carbon footprint of your car? You want to know how good or bad, what are the emissions associated with your car? So in order to do that, you really have to add up all the different emissions associated with it. And as I said, the way to do that is to put them into like a common metric. So you got to get the CO2e of each one of those emissions. So you add the CO2, the CO2e of methane, the CO2e of nitrous oxide, the CO2 of whatever air conditioner refrigerant. You add it all together, you get your total emissions. Now, important fact. In this example, I'm just considering the emissions coming out of the tailpipe and the air conditioner. In order to get the true carbon footprint of your car, you have to add up what are the emissions associated with making the car, mining the raw materials, getting it to you in Texas, because I know you're in Texas, using it, and then when you're done with it, disposing of it. But that's all for another discussion. We're gonna stick with this for now. So
that becomes a very complicated web, I'm sure.
It does.
Yes. That's really interesting. Okay, so there's a lot to kind of factor in and take into these conversations, but that does help us understand, something as basic as vehicle emissions. And so now that we understand the terms and kind of have an example, what's the first step to being more sustainable as a business? How should businesses approach this and understand these terms and then put them into practice?
So another great question. A lot of businesses don't know where to start. A lot of businesses are very far in their journey. They already have really rigid set, goals and metrics and all this. But, step one, set goals. Figure out, where are you now? Set a baseline. Where do you want to be? And then develop a plan to get there. Again, just focusing on the environmental pillar. Say you decide that you want to reduce your carbon footprint by 20% by 2025. So the first step is to figure out your baseline. Once our clients do this, they realize that their buildings are a huge part of their carbon footprint. And that's why they come see us. Consider the fact that in the US, 39% of emissions come from buildings. And since HVAC is generally half the energy bill, 40 to 50% of the energy bill for most commercial buildings, that means HVAC accounts for a huge portion of those emissions. So, and that's why we're here. That's why Boland is an energy company. Our clients are asking us now to frame energy savings projects, not just in return on investment, but in carbon footprint reduction. This is a huge change, even from a couple years ago. So, we're in our clients' buildings every day. We know them. We know their people. We know their business. We can help them set achievable goals that meet their needs, as well as local regulations, which are becoming more and more prevalent, as we all know, local, state, county, federal regulations. Then we help them figure out a plan to achieve their goals that also meets their financial criteria. So, we're lucky to be in an area, Tyler, here in the Washington, D.C. area that has governments and, energy utilities that really want you to reduce your carbon footprint. So, we look for incentives, grants, financing options, and really do whatever we can to help our clients, pay for those projects and achieve their sustainability goals.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, a really great way of putting it, and an excellent framework to think through how to set these goals, how to start these goals, and understanding terms and understanding what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability. Julie, any final thoughts here today before we wrap up this episode of the podcast? I think we've covered a lot of excellent ground here.
We have. We've gone a little long, so I'll keep it close. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, thank you for tuning into another episode of the podcast of 10 Minutes to a Better Building. For more, make sure to go to Boland.com to learn more about everything that they offer and how they can partner with you in helping you reach your sustainability goals. And of course, subscribe to the podcast to stay up to date with thought leadership like what you heard here today. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or of course by visiting the Boland website as well. And stay tuned. We'll be back soon with new episodes of the show. But for this one, for Julie Wolfington, I'm Tyler Kern. We'll talk to you again soon.